and then we will start some discussion about the weapons tech, drone tech, AI, and let's see, Bob's already in here. Our also my tech guy who does drone building, Luke, may join us because he actually is in the development of this stuff real time. Um, Driving back with the team, they're working on some. I don't want to get ahead of whatever he wants to announce. That's up to him. But some interesting stuff that's about defense with drones on the incoming side. And we just got through driving out to Sloviansk and seeing the netting along Izyum Highway down M3 down to Sloviansk and throughout the city. Um, Teams managing them, adding to them. It's not not something that makes me feel um, very spring-like when we drive through such beautiful terrain, and you know how beautiful Ukraine is.
Yes, for sure. And
It's
if I
brain-popping
was
stuff.
building out a new defense tech company, it would be robotic fence laying.
Right, right.
I would figure out a way to get those fences up, have that as automated as much as possible, because that I'm afraid that's the new normal.
It is, and it's we didn't want to film like how they're doing it. We have some general passing shots so people can understand what local citizens who have already been through so much are up to. Um, you so for our viewers, and if you don't know me, I'm Chris Sampson in Kyiv, and if you don't know Benjamin, this is Benjamin Cook, and I appreciate that we have a very common interest, which is understanding the defense of Ukraine, and also I think how that resonates to national security and defense elsewhere. Yes.
I think so, yeah, and also a general love for Ukraine. Get my bias out there up front.
And so how long for those who might not know, how long have you been coming back and forth?
15 years.
15
15 years.
years.
Yeah.
So you have a sense of what like the defense tech was like during Yanukovych when it had been slowly gutted out and
Yeah.
sold off and rusted out.
Sold off. Yeah. It was military back then was an extraction mechanism for extracting
Right.
wealth from the, which is what Russia was doing too. It
Right.
was a extraction mechanism. And then
Right.
everybody got caught, you know, with a military that doesn't work. It's just that Ukraine had seen that problem to some extent in 2014
Right.
and was working on it slowly, not near fast enough. It wasn't evident to Russia until the 3-day special military operation turned into 3 weeks, 3 months, and so on.
Yeah, I was here at that point. Actually, I was out of the country. I left February 23rd, 2022, and was back March 16th. But
Mhm.
I was here from January 31st to February 23rd on a waiting of every day, 5-minute departure in case something happened, and to be aware of the road conditions and the lay of the land.
Mhm.
Um, and then, so for the viewers, today is March 30th, in case this is from recordings. And we are now at the 4-year mark since the liberation of Bucha had begun. The liberation of the towns in the upper, 3/4, third or fourth quarter of our clock dial of Kiev, from
Mhm.
Makariv over to Moschun, had been liberated. And to this day, they haven't tried back from the north, but they're still pushing in the southeast where we were.
Mhm.
And the zero line is now a large kill zone of what, 20 to 25 kilometers, depending on where you're at. Yeah.
And
So,
that's one of the biggest changes in war fighting is the kill zone and the size of it. And there's no such thing really anymore as a front line, as a front zone. You know,
right,
uh,
right.
that's it's very different than anything that's happened before.
So what would you like our audience, if you were to say, okay, we're going to take the next hour or so to kind of talk through a lot of tech and development, but more important, I think it's the takeaway for the viewers to know what they didn't understand from the headline-oriented news about development, what it means both for Ukraine and the um, security of Ukraine, but also for Americans when it comes to understanding what's happening with Hegseth and in Trump in Iran, and bases being hit from lack of proper air defense and planning. And last is, how, like in my case, I know that there's not a lot of requests for Ukrainian trainers to help Americans, and that kind of bothers me. So,
Yeah.
shoot, go for it.
Yeah, so I think the main thing I would love for people to take away is if you're a Ukraine supporter, if you're an interested voter in Europe and in the US, if you're someone who watches the conflict and has questions, the main thing I want you to get out of it is the big news, the secret sauce that everybody talks about is drones, but it's not. It's the system surrounding the drones. The drone is the effect from the system. The systems that Ukraine has built are what's really impressive and what really should be getting the press and the news. But drones are natural clickbait. A headline that says iterative cycles improve on the front line. It's not really it's not gonna get it done,
Mm-hmm.
So, but the big news is the systems that Ukraine has built from scratch, basically, and the effectiveness that we see in the battle space is because of these systems, and we see it as drones, but it's not just. It's also procurement systems. It's also intel systems. It's management of data at a level that is new to the battle space.
Right. Well, as an example, for in the first year I was here, I knew that the IT sector was going to make history because of necessity, and that the Ukrainians, my background understanding of Ukrainian IT tech was related to software development and cybersecurity defense because of my studies of the Russians. Plus, I run a server company, so I've had blocks of Ukrainian IPs over the years. But it was limited to that. And yet, the people I met who were mobilized to the front fairly quickly had those skills. That's what they did the day before, right? As you know. And they may have been gamer developers. And the next thing you know, they're creating, integration systems for, FPV pilots in order to, increase the ability for their brother, their cousin, their best friend who's in the services to more precisely hit that target.
Yeah.
There
I
it is.
remember a time when people were working and fighting at the same time. I'm sure you remember it as well. People would be in
Oh yeah, right now.
and trenches and talking to their customers in the Europe and the US about what they had just sold them 3 weeks earlier. Yeah. I remember that time.
I have some soldier friends who are simultaneously doing. They're like, one guy is a money man. He knows how banks work and exchange rates, and I'm sure he's running those accounts at the same time as being in the Krematorsk region. So
yeah,
got to keep business going.
That's right. Well, to build on what you said, so it's not surprising that these guys sent to the front a minimally viable product, because that's what they've been doing their entire time. Is sending that MVP to the customer as quick as possible, get feedback as quick as possible, and then you iterate on that feedback. And so it's no surprise that that's exactly how things went when you send a bunch of tech guys and software engineers to go fight.
Well, we have a third person here, and drone maker and user of the system anyway. So welcome my friend Luke Fitch, who is a filmmaker, has been working on this drone tech for the entire 4 years. And to our audience, if you don't know Luke, follow his account and stay in touch. And what's your thoughts, good man?
Well, hello. This is my first time ever on a live Substack, so happy to join you guys. And yeah,
So he said about systems. He was talking about how the systems work in the background. I know you have a good sense of that. So what's your thoughts on that?
well, yeah. I mean, just talking now about this rapid R&D cycle that they've got, and how quickly the feedback goes from the users to the developers and back. And sometimes they're the same people, working here in the city and then going out to the front lines to test their latest creation. And, it's just something that's unheard of in the Western NATO kind of procurement circles, and how slowly things have to go through from the battlefield to, I mean, we're trying now, and I'm sure there's dozens of companies now suddenly working on Shahed interceptors, and there are the Western companies also that have been helping here with that kind of stuff. But I think we're finally waking up to the fact that you have to go from design and concept to battlefield testing and then mass production in just an astronomically shorter period of time than we're used to in the Western military world. So yeah, it's cool just seeing that in person. I don't know if Chris is. I think he's mentioned it a little bit, but we had a couple days out on the front lines last week and got to see some high level Ukrainian drone operators and stuff showing their latest stuff, not just in the showrooms and the testing grounds here in Ukraine, which you can see, and they're opening up to Westerners to, of course, they want to share this tech like a lot. Like they really, the idea that American equipment and personnel are getting destroyed and killed because they don't have some of these simple interception and mitigation and detection tactics for the Shaheeds and the FPV drones. Like
Right.
it's it drives me crazy as an American, but the Ukrainians are also like, why aren't you, you know, letting us share this, not just the equipment, obviously, but the tactics and the training and the techniques that make it successful. Because without all of those things working in harmony, things like interceptor drones just do not work. And yeah, they want to share it
Absolutely.
with us. So let's open our arms and take as much of this as we can.
Benjamin?
Yeah, I mean that's exactly it. It's why aren't people more open to allowing Ukraine to help them? And we saw some of that a couple of days ago with Rheinmetall CEO saying just horribly ignorant stuff about Ukraine. Um, at first, I was angry about it, but the second, I was like, this poor old man, think, seeing the world change in front of him, and he has no frame of understanding on what he's going to do with this $1 billion company going forward because he doesn't understand it. It's moved past him so fast that he doesn't understand it. He doesn't, when he makes fun of the housewives, what he doesn't understand is that distributed manufacturing is the new normal. He doesn't know this. He has no idea that this is the new normal. He talks about drones as Legos. He doesn't know that modularity is a cost cutting thing, that, if you're going to have any kind of success on the battlefield, you also have to have success on the bottom line. So these are things that this old guard doesn't really understand because they've never had to understand it. They were fine with iteration cycles that were years long. They were fine with procurement cycles that were years long.
Right.
Oh, it's gone forever, never to return. There's a reason that we're running out of Patriots, because nobody grabbed up RTX and Lockheed by the collar and say, either you make it at a pace and at a cost that we dictate to you, or we're coming in and we're going to nationalize this part of your business and we'll do it for you. And short of that, they're never going to change.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the other thing that's funny about the housewives comment is that, in a sense, that is kind of an accurate description of what things were like here in like late 2022, like 2023, as the FPV drone thing was just coming online. Like they didn't have the manufacturing here, and anyone who could contribute even a few dozen a month to the war effort were welcomed and useful. And what's funny is that basically that comment is like 2.5 years out of date, because what happened is when they started saying, okay, we need 1 million drones in 2024, we need 4 million in 2025. At that point, it just outpaced what the local small workshops could produce, because it became mass manufacturing in quantity, and also the quality standards really exceeded what someone assembling them in their living room could really do. And I feel like other countries are going to go through that same, they're going to go through like the housewives phase, where they don't have the production scaled up, and anyone who can cobble these together in their living quarters is going to be useful. But if you're in a prolonged war like this, it's either you get the mass manufacturing under control like they have here and get up to millions of units a year, or
Mhm.
it's like a stopgap measure that
Yeah.
other countries might want to be ready to do.
Mhm.
Every housewife should have a few dozen FPV kits worth of parts
Yeah.
stashed in their
Yeah.
closet, but that's only going to get you through a few months of intense combat before you need something more reliable.
Yeah. But I see the distributed manufacturing now to be mostly a defense mechanism. It's not a necessity in terms of scaling anymore. It's more a way to protect. You don't put all your eggs in one factory basket. You never want to completely centralize anything anymore. That's done. Those days are over with as well. And you need to get
Yeah,
it as close to
there's a
the battlefield
GRU
as possible.
unit just to watch for that.
Yeah. Yeah, and you need to get it as close to the battlefield as possible. I know of two manufacturers who I have come across. Everybody's hawking their wares on LinkedIn. They've got the next big thing. And I've only come across two manufacturers in 4 years that are containerizing their build processes to get it as close to the front as possible. That's the cost of doing business now. Is you have to get engineers and production capacity as close to the front as is possible. If you're lucky, maybe that doesn't mean inside Ukraine, depending on what it is you're building out. But if you're building drones, it most certainly means inside Ukraine. You can't wait for your iteration cycle to go all the way to Tucson, Arizona, to RTX in Tucson, Arizona, and then bounce all the way back to Ukraine and expect to compete on the battlefield. It's just not going to
Yep.
happen.
And
Or
there's
Luke,
really,
what about New Mexico?
well, I mean, before New Mexico, I was just going to mention when Chris and I last year visited a drone producer in 30 kilometers from Russian positions, and we asked them like, how does it compare being this close to the front lines versus the guys in Kyiv, Lviv, Poland, Germany, also building drones? And he's
Mhm.
like, yeah, he's like, the pilots can come and talk to us in the afternoon, and then that evening they're out flying the drones with maybe some change that we figured out, or at least we're now working on the problem that tomorrow we can give them because they can come and visit the workshop. And there's being in Ukraine is great no matter where you are if you're trying to develop this kind of stuff. I mean, any defense company should have a foot in the door here because you get access to rapid battlefield testing and communication from the guys using it. But that said, I'm from New Mexico. That's about as far, at least in terms of flights to get here. Like,
Yeah.
it is not an easy journey, but we're
Mhm.
trying to, with the military presence there, adapting these kinds of tactics to battlefield, to desert battlefield conditions, figuring out what works and what doesn't, and bringing the Ukrainians there because as much as we would love to bring, I think, more NATO and specifically American soldiers here to experience it firsthand, maybe not in frontline combat type stuff, but at least in
Mhm.
support and, training. Like 4 years ago, they would be doing the training. Now I think more it's we should be cycling them through for training
Yeah.
of what has been learned in the last 4 years. But since that's not going to happen and definitely not on a large scale, what we can do to now bring, like our friend Mikola, who we interviewed the other day, who's going to be on this series soon, he's demobilized now because of injuries, but he travels to the US and advocates for exactly this type of training and, two-way exchange so that if we can't bring them here to learn it, then at least we can bring some of the guys here there who have experienced it here to
Mhm.
New Mexico, North Carolina, anywhere that Middle East. Obviously, it's happening right now. It seems like Saudi Arabia is waking up to this faster
Mhm.
than America is. Like that's just shows how slowly we're responding to it. So
And it diminishes American capacity to project power when we make these poorly thought out decisions. Because exactly what are we projecting? I mean, we're talking about Ukraine being a defensive capability in the Gulf region without a blue water navy or expeditionary force. I mean, what does that mean going forward? It means that billions, trillions of dollars that you've spent are now wasted. You need to find a way to repurpose this. You need to start cracking open munitions and moving that energetic material to something that actually works on a modern battlefield and in a modern battle space, because that's the other thing we've learned. 10 years ago, people tried to make battle space take over battlefield. It didn't work. It didn't take. But now I think that is the best descriptor is battle space.
Well, speaking of that, in the weapons you just mentioned, I did a shoot down of the Hague-Seth Trump argument that they were having to borrow from stocks that were intended for Ukraine in order to battle, their impulsive war in Iran. And I don't know if you remember when Tomahawks were suddenly being shipped here and now can't be, but I don't remember that. Point being, the bullshittery and how weapons are made to supply that do not help us effectively fight either that war in Iran or help Ukraine win against Russia.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a standard administrative line to blame Ukraine. I'm not so conspiratorial that I think they get a fax or a secret email from the Kremlin and say, "Here's your talking points." But I am conspiratorial enough to know that it's there is a blame of Ukraine first narrative that we hear all the time.
Easy scapegoat.
You remember the Maui fires? That was the first time I really took note of this.
Maui fires.
In God's name did Ukraine, cause problems all the way in Hawaii? But it's
Maui fires.
Standard narrative that we hear out of this administration when they don't know what else to say. They can blame Ukraine.
I want to pivot to a couple of things because Luke's in here, and also to our viewers, thank you for being here. If you would like to let your friends know that we are live, you have some experts in these topics here with us. And you got Benj Cook on one frame here and Luke Fitch on the other. Luke works with NatSec Media, is a drone maker and filmmaker. And one of the things in my list that when I was talking to you, Benjamin, was how the tech has developed and where we're going. And I remember when Luke and I first met 4 years ago, we were talking about AI drone swarms because of everything from light shows and different types of arrays we knew were built. And it is a little surprising 4 years later, some of the tech we know exists in the world is not being deployed. And part of it we know is because of electronic warfare, et cetera. But what's your thoughts before I pass it to Luke?
Yeah, there's good reasons why we're not seeing autonomous drone swarms all over the battlefield. We do see loitering happen autonomously. Russia does that as well. They'll park them off the coast of Odessa. They'll park them outside of Kyiv proper, and then they'll figure out the best way to send them in. So we are seeing some swarming behavior, but it's not like there's autonomous targeting. That's the ability to put a bounding box around a target and say, hit this, is decades old. That is not new. That's right. Decades old. The ability to put a bounding box around the crease in between a tank's turret and its chassis and say, hit here while it's moving in winter, partially obscured, a little bit of smoke with the sun coming in behind you, that's hard. That's extremely hard. That's what AI is going to need to do. The model, the data set necessary that needs to be annotated is humbling on how much data it takes to do something like that. And nobody has more data than Ukraine. They're the only one who have it that's in a usable fashion. Russia has data as well, but it's not in a usable fashion like Ukraine has.
They have the Palantir hookup.
You have to use Ukraine's data, and it's just not enough yet.
Yeah. And they have the Palantir hookup, yeah.
Well, I mean, that definitely helped. I mean, they started off with a light version of Project Maven early on. And I have seen, and if anybody knows, please point me to it. I've been looking for it for years, a direct connection between Maven to like Ukraine's Avenger AI that they have, which is basically like a Maven type thing. And all this has been folded into their online C4 ISR, like Delta. It's all part of what they can do. So, I mean, a long way of answering your question is we're not where we thought we would be with AI, but for good reason. The math is hard. What we're
Sure.
trying to do is an extremely difficult thing. There are incremental successes. The low-hanging fruit has long been picked,
Right.
but the big thing is, how do you get past strong and ever-changing electronic warfare? And so far, the best answer anybody's come up with is fiber optics. I think there's still some innovations with fiber to come, but you have the square cube problem. You can only get so big before it becomes unwieldy and incapable of flying. But there will be some successes there. One of the things I haven't seen that I keep waiting for is pilot side AI. There is no discernible lag when you use fiber. You can put enough video transmission across it to lag it out. That is possible, but we don't really run into that as a problem. So that means you can have all of your compute, all of your AI on the pilot side, and nothing on that drone but ordnance and the basics to make it fly. And that's it. And then when you lose it, you've lost 4 motors, some controllers, and the ordnance, as opposed to a possible AI stack that can be reverse engineered and let your opponent know what it is you're building. But I haven't seen that yet. And I understand why, because it's just very limited range.
Right. Luke?
Yeah, no, I mean, I've, been working in fiber drones here for a year and a half, 2 years now. And, from the early days, trying to push like a wider view of thinking of these things. And, we'd helped prototype the first fiber ground station and stuff. And that's when we had a laptop running there. So we were like, can you think of now that you're getting a 60 frames per second, 1080p, like uncompressed, like what can you do with that? And, also, yeah, like Starlink is becoming the common way of ground robot UGVs, but also now um, flying drones. And we're like, how can you use these two together, like, or not just Starlink but any radio system? How can this be a backup? And they are now starting to do fiber drones that can be recovered by radio if the cable breaks, and dual dual control systems. But in terms of the AI, I think like Starlink is an example. Yesterday, I think they did the first Shahed interception with a Starlink, a pilot flying remotely. And like the Ukrainian perspective is that these pilots who have 2, 3, 4 years combat experience now are, for this war, better than the AI is likely to be trained for anytime soon. So AI can be like a backup for that last minute guidance when you lose signal due to either terrain or jamming or something as you get close, like, but still trying to keep a man in the loop as much as possible. And I think that's the better strategy. And until you have so many drones that you can't assign them pilots, it seems like the better option. And the more that we can start networking them all together, you can have pilot centers where your best pilots are all just waiting for a drone to, be assigned to them for a particular task. I think for ethical reasons, but also potentially tactical reasons, that seems like the better solution now. I think in the future, it starts to get scary if you have like an industrial power like China putting AI tech on their drones because they don't have the experienced pilots and they think they can write software that'll make it better. And they can, the video quality that's needed for a human to hit a target. Like I've seen Russian and Ukrainian pilots fly through insane amounts of static and jamming and still hit their target. And I think, obviously the AI doesn't need that because it's on board, but just, the camera quality can be really not that great and a human can still do the job. But once the AI starts getting cheap, zoom cameras and stuff can identify faces at a distance, and you have kamikaze drone swarms with that kind of technology, that's where we start to enter a really dark place. And I think for various reasons the Ukrainians are not going in that direction, but that doesn't mean that this kind of kamikaze drone mixed with some really smart software and a better camera and some better processing power doesn't become a really scary thing for humanity.
Benjamin?
Yeah, I mean, the new chips coming out are scary in what they can do. They've still got heat and electric problems. There's only so much battery you can put on a drone. And when you really start running some pretty thick edge computing, it can burn up battery pretty fast. But most of what we're doing right now could be done on a CPU on a Raspberry Pi in terms of putting the bounding box on something and say, run it to the back of this Shahid. That could be that. You don't need AI chips to do that. And then there's different levels of AI chip. You might need an AI chip, but it can be one that's the same thing that runs your computer's graphics. Can be a GPU, and there's all different kinds of things that need to be fixed before we can sit back and with satisfaction say, targeting has reached the battlefield, because that's the thing that's missing is targeting. Picking out what to hit is what's missing in terms of AI. Last mile, terminal guidance, all that. We're on the cusp of that getting better every day. But what we don't have is targeting.
Yeah. Actually, Luke, I just asked you what you would use some Raspberry Pis for just yesterday or this morning.
Yeah. Well, it's funny people talk about, the semiconductor wars and because China doesn't have access to the 2 nanometer, the 1 minute, like the really, it's like, oh, that's a military disadvantage for them. And I'm looking at the Raspberry Pis and stuff that are being used to guide, the stuff here. And it's like anyone who thinks you need the latest iPhone processor with Apple AI or something to do, guidance for a drone or, terrain navigation and stuff. All of this stuff was possible on chips we had 15, 20 years ago. And, it's only getting better, obviously. But this idea that China can't do the same type of AI drones because they don't have 2 nanometer chips, that's not really where you want the cheapest chip that can do the task. And I think, yeah, we're seeing that the requirements are not that much for navigation and targeting for sure.
If we step back and look at who's been serious about development across, we could just say the globe, and beside for the adversaries like Rubicon, etc. So in the case of allies, who have you seen step up that really shows persistently they get it? They put their money where their mouth is, and their actions follow.
Well, generally, if you have a border with Russia, you get it.
Fair enough.
That's generally how. If you wanted to build a new alliance that got it, you would start with the ones that border Russia. So yeah, I see. The Baltic nations are taking the drone development seriously. There's a lot of good innovation coming out of Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia. We're seeing where other European nations are finding success is when they partner and co-build with Ukraine. That's where they're finding success is the co-manufacturing with Ukraine. And where you're seeing people lag behind are the ones that are resting because they've got comfortable contracts or build something. They're too big to fail because they contribute something to the F-35, or they're the only one that can build a PAC-3 Patriot missile or something like that.
Or daddy's in the White House.
Yeah, that works too. Yeah, apparently
the kids of
the
for
Trump
those who don't
son
know,
who's in the drone business now.
Yeah, they're in the drone business now. Yeah, so they can go after antelope. In the case of
South, you're from the South. We've seen people use drones for hog hunting, so that's not new.
That wouldn't surprise me. I had not to get us off track, but I had a case of feral hogs hunting. Is a thing in the South, and there are some that use drones to do so as part of it. anyway, it's kind of bizarre. In the case of one of the things that happens here with the various defense tech forums and gatherings is trying to build Western investors, and you see a range of I don't know if they should be called startups, but basically financial initiatives that are trying to join those tech communities here. What are you seeing?
Yeah,
Either one of
I've
you, by the way.
actually, I've actually written something about this. I just haven't published it yet. If I was giving advice I shouldn't give, because I'm not someone who can give advice on where you invest, it would be something around. Here's what I would do if I had the money to invest. Let's say it that way: invest in the systems, not in the drones. Invest in the systems. And don't invest in anything AI that isn't based on building out infrastructure. That way, you're not investing in marketing. You're investing in something that's actually physically being built, because there's a lot of AI wash that goes on, even in
Right,
defense and
right.
security. You just stick that AI on there, and apparently it's modern and good. Even Benelli found a way to stick AI on a shotgun. But anyway, so that's basically it. Is don't fall for the trap of building out end products. Build the systems that support those end products, because most likely these systems are also dual use, which means that you're not just buying a Patriot missile that only gets used in the military. You're buying a drone motor or AI stack that gets used all over the place. If you miss one government contract here or there, your investment doesn't go to shit. If you do,
Right.
if you invest heavily in Lockheed Martin, and all of a sudden they do get nationalized because they can't build Patriots fast enough, you're in it deep.
Luke?
Yeah, and personally, what we've been pushing so heavily, while the U.S. tries to kind of figure out exactly what they're and NATO, like how they're going to integrate this technology and which systems are going to be used and stuff. The counter-UAS systems and the training to defend against this, we already know what it's going to look like. At least, if we're ever at war with, you know Russia or another country that's producing this type of drone. So I think one big aspect of it that's being missed is just all of the defensive drone systems and technologies and training programs and everything that's going to be needed to try and make it more survivable for you see FPV drones flying through the embassy in Baghdad and stuff right now. Like our embassy staffs and the Marines that are embassies, they don't have training for shooting down FPV drones with
And
shotguns
Luke,
and
we
stuff.
we
But
heard
like,
this we heard this in a lot of the interviews we've been doing on a regular level. Is that it's a little surprising to Ukrainians, like you said, Nicole Milnick, who's leader of the 47th Magura and Bradley commander, no less. And he just said, it's stunning that we have guys who fought for Ukraine who went back with all this experience to America, and no one's called them up. And you know a few, and I know a few.
yeah, no, exactly. Like, the training is the first thing we can do because we don't have to have all of our procurement and NDAA compliant drones and all of that figured out to at least start the training programs. And each, base and unit are starting to do it on their own, but there's not, regimented, there should be whole bases dedicated to this type of training that every army unit can cycle through and do 6 weeks of counter UAS training, because it's not just obviously there's jamming, there's kinetic, being able to shoot them down at with a shotgun at the last line of defense, but just understanding, learning basic piloting, not because your job is a pilot, your job might be driver, mess officer or something, but at least, like, if you're ever being targeted by one, what the camera capabilities are, and what work. You see the Russians, that they think it's like Jurassic Park. They're like, they can't see you if you're not moving. They can only see movement, like the T-Rex. But like obviously that doesn't work. That just makes it even easier for the FPV pilot to take them out. So, the more you understand these systems, the more likely you are to survive if you ever end up in the field, facing them from an adversary. So to me, that's the investment opportunity that, is only starting to exist, but I think it's going to be a multi-billion dollar industry
Yeah.
very soon.
Yeah, I've seen, the videos you're talking about where they're just freezing. And I think there's a new one. There's a new let's take people through the whole thing. So in the beginning, it was run. Then it was, if you see one, just kill yourself. And then it was freeze. And now it's turn your back to them. If you're wearing a backpack, turn your backpack to the drone. Maybe it hits the drone and you live. That seems to be the new advice that I'm extrapolating. I haven't seen any intel come across that says this is the new advice. But the videos I've seen, just there's far too many of them that are just turning their back for that not to be some sort of weird instruction that they're getting unmasked before deploying.
Yeah. And I mean, when you hear that like buzzing overhead, like there's like an animal response in you. And, if the training of what to do and how to assess the situation, if you haven't been through that, like once you only have a few seconds to decide how to respond when, when an FPV drone is coming at you. And it's not the kind of thing that you can watch a few YouTube videos or something and feel like
Yeah.
you understand the threat. Like this is something that's got to be drilled in as much as just like basic firearm practice and stuff.
I have a few soldier friends and then one photographer friend that have told me that who have survived FPV standoffs basically. And one of them was Safran Shikazi, my Japanese photographer friend who's in Carpathia Sich. He was in the Battle of New York, and the way he said it was he was leaning against a tree after a blast. I think it was a mortar, a tank round had hit there, and he looks up and there's a FPV just kind of hovering there, and he's leaning against a tree, stunned, and he's like, "This is how I go." Fuck. A comms comes in and says essentially, "We can't come get you. Try to be safe. We'll figure something out." It was a bit of a distraction. They got him out, but the drone, hearing that, moved to a different location and just happened to not take him. But the way he described it, just kind of hovering there with the bare sun of all the floral, because of the blast, everything, all the leaves and everything been blown off all the trees, and that's it. Like, this is how I go. Next thing you know, he's in the back of a Cossack, flying down the highway full speed, hit by one that just hit just off enough not to destroy the vehicle, and the second one, eluded them. But it's like, fuck me, fuck, you know.
Well, you hear, I
They,
mean,
they,
all of these lucky escapes, or the drone didn't detonate, or just
right,
barely
right,
missed and stuff, and that's the kind of thing that's going to go away. Like they're only going to become more reliable and more lethal and larger
yeah.
blast radius and all of that. So, you know, there's the people that are only alive now because it malfunctioned, but yeah, Russian quality control is not great in most cases.
Mhm.
But we can't assume the same is going to be true for, Iranians. Yeah, they don't have, the top tier FPV drones, or at least we haven't seen them in action yet. I know we obviously they have FPV drones, and if there's a ground invasion in the next few weeks, we're going to see for the first time how U.S. soldiers fend off like actual 2026 style FPV attacks, and it's going to be interesting to say the least. But even whatever Iran is using, like I'm sure are getting some of the later Russian models, and it's not like they're going to have obsolete, FPV drones, but they're also not going to have the latest and greatest that I think the Ukrainians and Russian units like Rubicon are using, because give them 6 months and a steady supply of parts from China, and they will get there very quickly. But it's kind of like once you have to have the guys using your drones and communicating back and what works and what doesn't. And the Iran's going to be a different battlefield, so there's different conditions and things to be taken into account. But it could happen next week that we see for the first time how prepared U.S. ground troops actually are for facing FPV attacks. And the worst case
Yeah,
scenario in my mind is horrendous, and let's hope it's not as bad as that worst case scenario.
Yeah.
I
Is
give
there?
the U.S. 3 weeks that they put boots on the ground. That if they can do what they want to do and get out in about 3 weeks, it'll be minimal how much FPV and Shaheed and short range the attacks that they need to defend. But after about 3 weeks, it's going to be nonstop, day and night. Because that's about how much time it's going to take them, the Iranians, to figure out how to get in. What works, what doesn't.
Yeah, they're going to try.
What American EW is able to accomplish and what it can't. What wavelengths are working and what aren't.
Yeah.
Well, I wrote a piece a few weeks ago, and it's largely out of the kind of combined work of seeing what happens here in Ukraine, and then I'm pretty fast on the Kiel Institute data that's been coming out for years, so I watch how much all the countries put into big equipment. And again, Mykola Melnick says this best. He's like, these different American colonels come up and say, how many Bradleys would it take to take out a T-90? He goes, why would I use Bradleys? They're great. But for about $1,500 worth of drones, I can do a far better job, much quicker, and save the Bradleys for a different part of the fight. And they don't get this. They don't understand what he's saying because the wiring of the American arsenal is so power comes out of money, comes out of hard investment, and like you said, the slow procurement process, no less. And if you look at the math, Iran understands this equation very well. That getting upwards of 850, nearly 900 tomahawks fired costs some fucking money.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's two lines you have to control: the front line and your bottom line. And if
Sun
America's
Tzu
weak,
said it explicitly. He said it explicitly 2,500 years ago. Don't blow the people's resources over a war way the fuck over there.
yeah, and it's everyone knows now that the weak point with Western armies is attrition. They're not willing to invoke austerity measures or go to a war footing to fight anything going forward. It's just not going to happen. They'd rather retreat. The embarrassment of retreating and losing apparently has been normalized and internalized, and we don't mind it anymore for some reason. And so all China knows and all Iran knows is if you could get the U.S. in a war of attrition and score some successes, the people back home will make them turn around and come home. I mean, the only thing that China has to do is overwhelm a battle group's defenses.
That's right.
And sink one ship, and that's it. We're done.
So I'm gonna ask this to you, Luke. But first, I want to talk to Joe, who's in our space, who said this is terrible. Meanwhile, me at LA gets to peacefully march in a goofy giraffe costume. It's so imbalanced. Joe, thank you for marching in your goofy giraffe costume. I thank you from Kyiv. I don't want you to minimize that. It probably has its place. Do the best. Be the best fucking goofy giraffe costume resistor in the fucking world. So thank you. Luke, we talked about this, and it's sort of the root of the documentary you're working on, The Art of Drone Warfare, where it's not about big and might, it's about success. And as you know from the drone tech as it's been developing here, and the capabilities of China, and what we talked about, clusters of AI swarms, etc. Talk to that reality of an aircraft carrier being overwhelmed by a swarm of drones.
Yeah, for sure. First off, my mom sent me pictures of her at the No Kings protest this weekend, so she had a cool sign and stuff. We're all doing what we can. And last year, when the first No Kings was happening, I was here in Ukraine with my girlfriend, and she was basically we were here for the inauguration, and then the weeks after, and she was like, "Oh, I wish we were doing more," and I'm like, "Hey, we're here in Ukraine, like, we
Right,
had a
right, right.
Shahid attack last night flying over apartments, so I think
Right.
we're doing our part, but
You're in the mix.
everyone finds their own way to help, but yeah, I mean, the thing about this Iran war, if we end up with our ground forces in combat with Iranian army, that's such a stupidly avoidable war where suddenly like the Ukraine Russia war tactics become a lot more relevant, because we were expecting it was going to be something over, Taiwan, where you have 100 and something kilometers of ocean, like
Right.
FPV drone tactics you can't take out a carrier battle group with FPV drones and stuff. But now we're looking at being engaged in a ground war that we're not prepared for, because we weren't studying the tactics of, what's been going on here. And, in a lot of
Hmm.
ways, the terrain doesn't make a difference when you're talking about close in, having US forces within fiber optic drone range of the enemy is not something any of our branches of the military are prepared for right now. So if we had stayed focused on, what can we learn from this war in terms of a potential conflict with China over Taiwan, and how do we deter that? That was kind of a long-term thing that we were, I think, doing slowly, but at least we understood that we don't need to be training every member of our army to defend against FPV drones, because they weren't ever going to be facing that threat. Now, that's a very different potential situation that, yeah, we're not prepared for at all. So, does this render the carrier battle group completely irrelevant in terms of a China Taiwan war? Not necessarily, because that's a completely different type of drone or rocket. AI, if you can combine hypersonics with good AI guidance that can, identify a carrier and do that terminal guidance, like, yeah, that becomes a threat. But that's totally different than what guides an FPV drone in to hit the tank for the last 20 meters or whatever. So, similar concepts, but just on totally different levels. But what we're going to see in Iran might be a lot closer to what's happening here in Ukraine than anyone was really getting ready for.
Well, it's the further the boats are in the U.S. and the allied boats are from China and Taiwan, it becomes orders of magnitude harder to hit, because China just doesn't have the satellite network to cover the amount of ocean it would need to cover to know where they are. They would have some sense of it, but they wouldn't know exactly where it is. And the further it is away, it becomes harder exponentially to figure that out. That's the only thing we got going for us here in the U.S. But you know, bases in the Philippines don't move. That's an aircraft carrier that doesn't move. Bases
Guam
in
doesn't move.
bases in
Right.
Japan don't move.
Wait, doesn't
Um,
it tip over when there's too much weight on it?
it does. That's how islands work. Exactly. At least that's how I go with it. It's not going to be easy for China, but they
Sorry to
only have to
Hank
get it right
Johnson, who
once.
will forever never live that down. To Hank Johnson, who should have never said such a stupid thing.
Yeah. That's like the internet is a series of tubes. You remember
Yeah.
that?
No wonder we're fucked. Anyway, sorry.
Yeah, so I mean, what are drones going to do to aircraft battle groups? Well, the long range ones are going to be targets. You're going to have to. It's going to cause commanders to make terrible decisions. You know, I don't mean the wrong decision. I mean having, what is it? Ryan McBeth says, "Don't cause your enemy problems, cause them dilemmas." It's going to
Right.
cause a lot of dilemmas. How many Shahid type long range or Ukrainian type long range drones that China has? How many do I let through to make sure that I have enough munitions to shoot down the ballistics when they come in? Because
Right.
like the U.S. Navy is stocked full of interceptors, they are trying to some extent to have that capability, but it's moving at the normal procurement pace, which is to say they're not going to have it anytime soon. So they're going to have to figure out, okay, so these long range drones, there's 60 of them. We've got CWIS that can knock down a lot of them, but there's so many that would even give CWIS pause. We've got other munitions that can knock them down, but man, we're spending, $2 million a shot to knock down a $50,000 Shahed. What do we do? So that's the dilemma.
Call Ukrainians and ask them for a card.
Yeah, call Ukrainians and say, "Hey, do you got any spare cards we can borrow?"
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
I told Lisa Boyko that they needed to rename the AI center that they just opened with Palantir. They need to call it the Ukrainian. I can't remember what it was. I sent it to her in Ukrainian, but I can't remember what it is. But basically, it's the Ukrainian phrase for deck of cards.
Oh yeah, right. Yeah, and this is where I have such people who have not understood my attitude problem for Ukrainians in favor of Ukrainians is that I got early on that from Robotica, who I saw in February 2022 doing UGVs in Lviv, to FPVs being made in people's apartments here that were civilians whose maybe brother or cousin was at the front, and they're like, well, I'm figuring out how to use my 3D printer to make the right arms. And then I've seen some of the work Luke's done. I've seen that this is the most organic, ground up warfare pushback that one could imagine, and yet with the technical level that's available in the United States and its industry level, even though we've gutted our industry class, it's a Netflix world. It's a what's on YouTube kind of reality. For like No Kings happens, and then when's the next one? May. And I'm in Ukraine, where in 7 days after Nabu and Sapu had changes enacted, like within 7 days it was reversed because people hit the street and wouldn't let the fuck up until it was over. Like, there you go. So
yeah, as long as we've got our Netflix and we've got our food delivery, we'll be fine.
So Luke, I don't know if you heard, but Benjamin has been in the area for 15 years. So we got a lot of experience about how the weapons industry had been. When you and I were at the Brave One, and you saw how much, how many booths that you were at, what was your thought about where this country's going when it comes to like the center of gravity for weapons development?
Yeah, well, that was 6 months ago that we saw the kind of the showcase of the latest and greatest of Ukrainian drone tech, all very focused towards the Western market and potential export customers and stuff, which I think they understand will provide funding to continue the development and keeping up supplies to the soldiers here that are using it. So that's cool. Um, at the same time, like Chris and I saw last week, it's this war is such a mix of like the latest high tech, maybe not like the latest greatest, like most expensive, not like U.S. military grade drones and stuff, because they understand. For the price of one Reaper drone, you can deploy dozens of Ukrainian made reconnaissance drones with less capabilities, but if one gets shot down, you didn't just lose millions of dollars. So, but still, like, at the Brave One showcase, they're showing off the best stuff that they've got. But then when you get out to the front, like, you have entire cities like converting themselves into a drone proofing the city, and it's like netting. And we saw last year, and maybe even like late 2024, when the first net system started going up and stuff. But now they've got this down to a, like, the demining crews go through, flag the road, two guys with the generator and the auger come through to make the poles, next team comes through and drops the post, and the only guys that are really at risk are the ones up on the scaffolding that they wheel down from post to post, putting up the netting. So they deploy point guards of shotgun teams to defend those guys because they're such targets. But once the netting goes up, obviously they only protect against FPV drones and stuff, but it's creating a sense of safety in these cities so that they can keep providing frontline logistics. And it's not just about who has the latest high-tech drones, but who can survive, keep your logistics operational under that kind of threat. And in a lot of cases, it's fishing nets and wood posts and stuff. So I think if the US Army and NATO's so focused on these trillions of dollars we've invented on the latest high-tech systems for a naval war, for an air war, that kind of stuff works. But all of that kind of planning, if it's more than a year or two out of date, it's not going to work in a ground war where your opponent has access to modern drone equipment.
Yeah, let me
Yeah,
throw it to
I
you real
talked to
quick.
somebody the other day. I said, listen, I don't know that you can say the U.S. has air dominance or air superiority anymore.
No.
And the way most people counter that is they move the goalposts. So if you can't do case vac, if you can't do medevac, if you can't insert and rotate, you don't have air superiority.
That's correct.
I'm sorry, but you don't. You might have it above 30,000 feet, but if you can't do close-in air support, if you can't.
And that's been the whole playbook for the entire GWAT and eras of air superiority has been the key to American dominance, and that
Yeah,
changed now.
yeah. I mean, that's the thing that scares me most with these Marines going into Iran is, what happens after
Exactly.
the 3-week period I predict, and they got to get people pulled out of there,
Right.
and then your helicopter gets hit. I mean, what next? And then they start hitting your Humvees, and then they start hitting your whatever rear area you've decided is your rear area. That starts getting hit as well. So
I mean,
yeah,
Russians, for instance, do not fly. I never hear aircraft except for I heard a helicopter today move across town. But mostly it's been grounded for 4 years. Air dominance is not a thing. And Zaluzhny, one of his pieces a few years ago about positional warfare, the key he was saying was we saw how quickly air dominance changed, and therefore it went to a ground warfare. And at that point, like he avoided trying to going to what people kept calling inappropriately a stalemate position. He basically more appropriately referred to it as a static positional warfare. But it's all on the ground, except when it comes to the drone warfare. And now the American model for fighting has been one kind of model for as long as I've been alive, and there is no training, or I should say, there is no, I don't know what the training would look like, but there's no experience in fighting the two against each other in American textbooks now.
Yeah, the closest thing analog I can come up with is when the U.S. faced jungle warfare in Vietnam, how caught off guard they were with
Okay,
jungle
fair,
warfare.
right? Good point. Yeah,
To a certain extent,
air raid here in
insurgencies
Kyiv
in
going off in the
Iraq
background.
was an eye opener as well. But we quickly, not quick enough, but we quickly figured out insurgencies and that sort of thing. And so the U.S. given time will definitely figure it out. They'll throw money and some extremely smart people at it, and they'll figure it out. But unfortunately, people are dying in the meantime.
Yeah.
So why not figure it out now? Why not contract with Ukraine now? See who they are and what they are,
Exactly.
and do it.
Speaking of which, two of your hosts here for our wonderful friends can tell you that we live with active air raids even as we speak. So, speaking of air raid, air
Mhm.
war, missiles and/or drones active at this very time, and
Can't really hear the sirens well from Chris's house, but they're pretty loud at my place.
I can hear somebody's. I don't know whose it is. But
I think that's mine.
it's a practical saving line.
yeah, so I had an
Ukrainian
acquaintance
friends talking
of
about
mine
how
get internet
go for it.
famous this past week because she had Shaheed explode right next to her house, and not how you want to get internet famous.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, we were buying drone parts from a shop a few days ago that had all plywood windows because they were hit a few weeks ago, and yeah, it's becoming a
Yeah.
routine thing here. I mean, we saw him doing it in Kharkiv.
Mm-hmm.
8 hours after the Shaheed strike, they already had almost all the windows replaced by. They have trucks just loaded up with plywood, ready to go. The next time a building gets hit, city has a crew show up, and by midday the next day, they've.
And the
Well, I mean,
hotel you and
Ukrainians
I were
themselves,
scheduled to
even if they're
stay
not
at.
in a crew, they show up and start, dealing with the destruction and cleaning it up. I've seen it myself many times. It's like, so the last time I was there was 2023, and I was there when the grain deal was X'd, and Russia bombed, Odessa for 2 weeks straight every day. And so, one of the things that really stuck in my head was that people would show up with brooms and dustpans and start dealing with it. Of course, there was the people who would, these people aren't lifting huge boulders or whatever, but the glass and the debris and the dust that settles, just regular Ukrainians showing up without anybody saying, "Hey, come do this." They just show up and start doing it.
Right. We have MiG-31s in the air, by the way, for those who are paying attention, for a possibility of firing of Kinzhal missiles, as we've been threatened with all day long. So fuck Russia, пиздец Российской Федерации. We are expecting the possibility that there may be Kinzhals fired somewhere towards Ukraine throughout the broadcast. Anyway, Chris Sampson here live from Kyiv. Luke Fitch over there live from Kyiv. And then we have Benjamin Cook. And you are where
Safe and
precisely?
secure in an undisclosed location. No, I'm in South Carolina.
South Carolina. I am so sorry. We worry for you.
You blew my optic. No, I will be. I'll be. Now, speaking of OPSEC, I am not going to broadcast exactly when and where I'll be, but I'll be towards the end of May.
Come have coffee with us. That's a very important part of what we do. Coffee.
I definitely will.
Lots of coffee. But seriously, we do have an air raid that has now blanketed the country. I'm looking at the map. Everywhere is red. And so that's due to the missiles. Interceptors, etc. The reality on the ground and the cards at hand with the Ukrainians show that America is not the only country paying attention. Saudi Arabia and others are saying, "We will talk. Give me a call. Come on, Volodymyr. Let's have a meeting." What do you think that's going to do for America's standing when it comes to, like, in the political system? You have all of this investment going overseas, opportunities and developments going overseas. How do you see that playing out back home when it comes to ballot box, etc.?
Well, I think it's going to go well.
Pick that apart as you wait.
I don't think it's going to go well for Republicans at all. I think the midterms they're going to get trashed in the midterms. Now, everybody knows this. Midterms is about getting out the vote. It doesn't. That's how you win a midterm, is you get out the vote. It doesn't matter about candidates. You can saturate with people voting, and whoever does that the best is who wins. But and I
call that the Bernie effect. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you had the biggest rally. Yeah. But if you don't show up later, it doesn't matter.
That's right. Exactly. So, but I do think Democrats will get the vote out. They're very motivated, and history says midterms are tough for all presidents, regardless of party.
True.
So I think that's going to be a problem. And I think as soon as the Congress changes, so will people's attitudes, so will other politicians' attitudes towards Trump, because it's very, politics is very much, what have you done for me lately? And
right.
If Trump can't rally the, like, there's a guy in South Carolina who's running for Ralph Norman's seat, because Ralph Norman's going to run for governor. Ralph Norman is not a Ukraine supporter; he is a Republican. But Joe Wilson, is another congressman from South Carolina who is a tremendous Ukraine supporter. So it's not a South Carolina thing. But anyway, this guy is running, Trump as his running mate, sort of thing. It's like Trump this in his campaign ads, Trump this, Trump that.
Right.
That's going to work in the primary, maybe, but it's not going to work in the general. In November. The primary here for him is in June. So it'll be interesting to see how he changes his term or his tone when he's got to try to compete against Democrats for that seat,
Right.
and what he says and what he does.
Right.
Well, I mean, I think personally, I think one of the most despicable things that he has done since 4 weeks ago launching this war is the way that he's reacted to the fact that Russia is actively helping Iran target and kill American troops. And he just kind of shrugs it off and says, "Oh, well, we're helping them with targeting in Ukraine, so I guess it's all fine." Or like as if this doesn't like his desire to score a political point against Biden and Ukraine by saying that they wasted all the weapons that supposedly, like, as if we were going to be firing ATACMS in Iran right now, or the thing. Obviously, we know that the weapons that we're using now are not the ones that were given, but that point is so important to him that he's just going to shrug off the fact that Russians, and yeah, right now US deaths are 13 or something, hundreds of millions of dollars, and you count the planes and stuff, but still where he can kind of shrug it off. But if this drags on into the summer and US casualties start mounting, like, when do regular like MAGA voters realize that the fact that Russia is helping Iran to target and kill Americans,
Mhm.
like, and like, to them, like, Putin and Trump being friends is kind of a joke. The ones that don't like Putin still don't really care that much that they're buddy buddy, and a lot of them think that Putin is the type of ally we should have right now. So it's going to affect these people differently, but like, at what point does the fact that Russia is helping like target and destroy American assets and kill our soldiers become a political liability for those base voters? Because at some point I would think that that's going to start having an effect on them.
Yeah, the true believers, no, there's nothing you could do for the true
Right,
believers.
there's that 20% that
Yeah,
whatever.
that's in every
Right.
party. And those are the ones who are going to come out and vote. So that's what makes them extremely dangerous. Um, but everybody else, I think you're 100% right that it's, the gas prices. It's what was it that James Carville told Bill Clinton's staff? It's the economy, stupid, and it's
Right.
always the economy, stupid. You know, and I
Right.
stole that, by the way. I tell people in the defense industry, it's the feedback, stupid. You want to figure out what the big thing out of Ukraine is. It's the iterative feedback cycles, the fast fail cycles. But anyway, back to politics. It's the economy, stupid. So. The gas prices, the prices at the grocery stores, the small salaries, this, that, and the other. I'm not hearing any Republicans say anything other than you're going to have to suffer while we fight Iran. That was Trump's. That was what he said. It's a small cost. I think something to the worst to the effect of it's a small price to pay for a non-nuclear Iran. And I don't disagree with that for a non-nuclear Iran. I'm just unconvinced that any of this is going to result in a non-nuclear Iran.
Precisely. Before the question disappears, because one of our viewers called back to Norma's question. Question comes from someone who doesn't follow drone tech. The UK has a laser thing rolling out in the Navy. Does Ukraine have many lasers to cut fiber drones, etc.? So, Luke, we talked about this before, and if you want to take that about, laser, defense systems that are being used to detect and sever fiber lines.
Yeah, it's an interesting topic, particularly close to my heart because I actually have a $1,000 bet with my buddy that he proposed, not me. I wanted to bet $100. He raised me to 1,000. based on what the laser technique they're actually using to whether they're cutting the fiber or burning out the photoreceptors inside the. So if anyone knows, exactly how Ukraine is currently, using lasers to mitigate especially for the loitering fiber drones where you pre-position
Right.
them along a roadway and then wait for them. This would
Right.
be a way that you could now kind of sweep that roadway with these lasers ahead of time. You don't know exactly where the loitering drone is, but if you just sweep the laser up and down, you are one way or another disabling that drone. So yeah, that's very new. In New Mexico, that's where one of the things we're trying to get more Ukrainian drones out there is for, you know, simulating aggressor drones for the laser systems that actually burn them out of the sky. And I think that's, what the UK systems are all based around. And, much higher wattage laser because you're shooting it over a distance. But supposedly Ukraine is working on their own on like a high level. Lots of smaller guys here. We saw in Lviv when some guys had little lasers on a tripod that a human could operate, and no videos or anything of how it works. So this is
Mhm.
all kind of new territory with, how much power can you blast out of cheap Chinese laser diodes, and how effective is that against FPV drones and stuff. We're kind of figuring it out. I think, cities like Kyiv that are under persistent drone threat like this in the future are going to have energy point defenses, because that's how you win the ammunition. um, like let's say U.S. Marines take Karg Island or one of these Uranian islands,
Mhm.
and we get some Navy ships in there, and maybe some of the land-based CWIS systems and stuff. But if logistics are too hard to keep those systems supplied with reloads, then over a few months, that's when suddenly the IRGC could suddenly have the upper hand, like overnight, and the whole situation could change. If you have an energy based weapon that can stop the drones, that's a different situation. But the U.S. doesn't have anything like that we could deploy right now. And Kyiv being such an obvious target, I think this is where other than Israel has theirs operational. Um, Iron Arrow or David Sling, I forget which one it's called, all their biblical
Right.
names. I think Kiev's will probably be operational in the next year or two. I don't know if you'll see it. It might not be a visible light, maybe with an infrared camera or something. But yeah,
And won't the
different
objective
applications of lasers. And
right.
I never, I'm having to learn about lasers now for the first time since reading Star Wars as a kid, because it was never that relevant to my previous work. But now that's changing. So yeah, I guess one more subject we all got to be brushing up on in our free time.
And won't the objective ultimately be to make it cost ineffective for Russia to launch that kind of war and shift to a different style of war? If every time they throw up 1,000, Shahed drones, they just become debris on the ground and no impact on the community or for infrastructure, they have to switch to a new tactic.
Yeah, I mean that happened the other day, didn't it? The Russians sent it was a day attack. They sent all these drones over, and Ukraine shot 100% of them out of the sky, or
Yeah,
suppressed 100% of them.
relatively close to 100%, right?
Yeah, so we're getting there. The thing with lasers and energy weapons is they're not mobile. Not yet. Um,
Right.
you could fill up a truck with a bunch of capacitors, but you're not going to get me to get in there, because that's just an electric chair riding down the road. Um, but for point defense, lasers and
Benjamin, take it for the team, bro. Take it for the team.
yeah, exactly. Even though I come out a little crispy, it'll be all right. But so as part of an Iron Dome type scenario, I think it's a fantastic research field, and I'm hoping for big things because it definitely will work. You have
Yeah.
to have great tracking, though. That's the thing. You've got to have that laser on something for a period of time, a couple of seconds, from what I've seen. Um, and you need to hit somewhere good. Burning through part of a Shahed wing that isn't really doing anything isn't going to do much. You need to hit the fuselage And the smaller the drone, the harder it's going to be to do it.
Right.
The I like, but you have to be careful of because you'll fry everything in its path. Is the microwave weapons because again the problem is they don't discriminate. They're going to fry everything,
Right.
but they work extremely well. But you're talking about a shit ton of energy dumped at a very small amount of time, and that you don't want to be on the other side of that. So cell phone towers, actual mobile phones, everything in that path is going to get it.
Right.
The thing that I haven't seen used, we talk about lasers burning out video sensors, is strobes. Video is done at a certain hertz rate, and I've
Right.
always wondered if strobes at a certain hertz rate would disable, long enough to matter, drones video. I've never seen anything about that.
Luke, what do you think of that? I know you have some sense of that.
Yeah, I mean, with the electronic sensors, one thing we were looking at was just using lasers to try and, it was when last year they started putting cameras on the Shaheeds, and that's how they were using, like, Shaheeds are generally don't have any type of camera on them. I don't know if that's commonly known or not, but they're guided. Yeah, because Russia really didn't have a reliable way to get video out from Ukraine. And it was when they started putting Starlinks on the Shaheeds that suddenly they had the option where a pilot could take it over and steer it into a train or a pit preschool or those civilian trains, those high value military
Right.
targets that Russia's out seeking. So we were thinking, okay, if you can't burn the Shaheed out of the sky with a laser, like could the trains, for example, have a high powered enough laser that they could just burn out that camera, and now the likelihood of it hitting the train is a lot less. So basically you're like overloading the sensor itself with enough energy that you burn out those pixels. So it takes a lot of energy, and I think a laser is the only thing that's going to focus. Electronic sensors are pretty good. Like we had a video camera when I was a kid, and my dad was like, "Don't point it at the sun." Like I did it once. He's like, "You're going to burn out the video tube in there." But yeah, modern sensors are pretty good for taking a lot of light, but when you have that heat concentrated through a laser,
Mhm.
that's what starts to burn out the imaging sensor.
Well, if
Exactly.
there's anything mobile that can hold the power necessary to have a good energy weapon, it would be a train. You can put enough
Yeah,
generation on
exactly.
a train, and that's actually a pretty interesting and good idea.
Hmm.
Um,
Good point.
is to put that on a train because trucks. It would have to be a flatbed semi, to move the laser around. For it to
Really
have
trying to.
for
I mean,
heat.
you could have like the Ukrainian trains. Either they're pulling three-phase power directly from the overhead lines, or they have diesel generators that are then powering the electric motors. You could have the engineer just flip a switch, and all that power that was going to the motors is now just going into your giant locomotive-mounted
Mhm.
Shaheed cannon.
Yeah,
So, yep.
yeah, that's definitely a possibility. It's things like that that are going to be the next iteration. I remember in the beginning where people was like, "Well, what about Well, we can't get the FPVs out there far enough. The line of sight is killing us." Well, then you stick up a mothership that either leapfrogs it out there or it's got enough power. It's just that you can't get the signal over the horizon. So you stick a mother drone or a signal drone out there, a relay. That very quickly became standard.
Right. The Baba,
Yes.
Baba Yaga concept.
Hmm.
Now they call them, it's either a retrick or a retranslator. So
Right.
I kept calling our design a relay drone, but I very
Hmm.
quickly realized retranslator's the term here. So now I'm
Hmm.
talking to Americans and I'm like, oh, and this was our retranslator drone design, and I'm like, oh, I mean relay drone.
Yeah.
Right.
So yeah, no, it's something that seemed like a novelty 3 years ago.
Hmm.
Now it's common practice. Every FPV drone team uses them. So
Yeah.
yeah.
So final round of commentary for both of you. Benjamin, with we're now just past 1 month in this fight with Iran. I've written several pieces about essentially I juxtapose Trump and Hegseth on one side and Putin and his shitbags on the other side against Sun Tzu's 13 chapters of the art of war, so that each part of the distillation that wisdom is applied to their fuck ups and foibles. Um, where do you see that people need to be watching this week? You know, as the rest of the uh, both sides, you know, these two wars unfold,
Mhm.
and you know, what do you think they should be focused on and paying attention to?
Well, don't rely on Iran to blink. They might. I hope they do, but don't rely on it.
Hmm.
They may blink after Trump makes good on blowing up, or taking Carg Island and choking off a significant supply of income for them. That will
Hmm.
come at calls for the U.S. They may blink with other things. I don't know, but I wouldn't rely on it because the thing that's happened is we've de facto given the Strait of Hormuz to Iran because we've allowed them to decide when it opens or not. And that's
Right.
probably going to be the biggest mistake historians seize on from this, is that through this ridiculous, poorly planned operation, that they basically gave the Strait of Hormuz to Iran because you put it in their court to make the decision.
Right.
So that's the thing to look for: is do they make that decision or not? I hope against hope that we don't put boots on the ground. I don't mind diplomacy from 30,000 feet. I'm a realist. I'm a pretty hardcore realist, so I don't mind 30,000 foot diplomacy. But boots on the ground, and also, when I say boots on the ground, I mean rank and file soldiers. I also don't mind special forces in there doing special forces things. I don't consider that boots on the ground. I consider that just what we do on a daily basis.
Hmm.
Um, but if we put boots on the ground,
The as I say, the owls are not what they seem.
yeah, yeah, the calculus changes as soon as we put boots on the ground.
Right.
So let's hope we can figure out a solution that doesn't involve that.
Luke.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the miscalculation is just beginning to play itself out, and it could be just kind of bad, or it could be really bad. And I think, that we went into this without the proper, you know, preparations and consultations, and, working with our allies who have combat experience. And maybe it all gets better from here, and gas prices are back to where they were in November, and people have already forgot about it by then. I think that's unlikely. And even if you look at, the betting odds, like the Democrats are now favored to win the Senate in terms of on the betting markets and stuff. And obviously those are only so accurate, but I mean, people are starting to realize like there is no easy way to unfuck this situation. And like a ground war doesn't do it, but it will be a political disaster for Trump, but
Mm.
doing nothing doesn't do it either. And, as much as I want to see him just and the Republicans get destroyed in November, with a Democrat majority, we could see weapons aid to Ukraine potentially again. I don't know if Trump would sign it, but, if you had a Democrat House and Senate passing it, they don't need that many Republicans to make it veto proof at this point. We saw under the Biden administration that aid to Ukraine was one of the most, bipartisan, palatable issues in the country right now. So that's my best case scenario, and that means, yeah, Trump really paying a price for this war of
Yeah,
choice.
the beauty of it is that Mike Johnson would be thrown the fuck out of that
Yeah.
position.
Oh
He
God, I would
was
love to see that guy
the
never on the front page
clusterfuck.
of the news
I mean,
again.
he stonewalled all aid months before the April 2024 final passage just to get Trump a win. And I've written out calculation after calculation of what that caused here.
Mhm.
You
But
know,
then the
and
other thing, Chris, you
yeah,
and
go
I were
for it.
talking about yesterday is at the same time, what this war has done is given Putin a financial lifeline that, you know,
Right.
the Ukrainian kinetic sanctions and stuff on the energy infrastructure were, combined with Trump's sanctions, basically the one proactive thing he did to bring this war to a close, were starting to have an effect. Like, was it going to end the war this year? Probably not. But by next year, the Russian finances were going to be in really dismal shape. And that has completely changed now. And so what I see is every month or two that the Iran war gets prolonged is months of additional funding that Russia has to maintain their war at the current level.
And I
So
think that seeing the Ukrainian sanctions in action on a regular basis
yeah,
are a
and
much better way to go.
that's the consolation prize in all of this. That as oil prices have shot through the roof, the Ukrainian kinetic sanctions on the Russian oil and gas industry have also increased, and it looks like the Primorsk terminal is potentially completely offline at this point. So but until they can figure out how to hit Vladivostok and shut down the shipping on the Pacific side of things, like Putin is always going to have a cash cow as long as he can get oil out, and at $115 a
Right.
barrel, they can subsist on a lot less export than they had before. But if Europe doubles down on, blocking the shadow fleet, Ukraine keeps up their drone and missile attacks, maybe the damage from the Iran war
That's
in
right.
terms of, giving Putin a financial lifeline will not be as bad. But that's the part that just hurts me the most in all of this. And if that gets combined with high U.S. casualties and, showing just how weak the U.S. military really has become, or the U.S., not just military, like the U.S. as a
Right.
nation, I don't want that to be the case. That's why I'm advocating for all of these changes. And but if it gets just laid bare to the whole world for the whole world to see, that's going to be painful because we've been yelling as loud as we can for years now that there's a better way to do this, and we'll find out.
And there's,
And I
the beef of it is that there's going to be absolutely no way to show that we've accomplished the number one goal, which was a non-nuclear Iran. There's no version of events where anything we do can ever guarantee that.
That's
You know,
right.
Yep. I mean,
and
I guess, yeah, digging out the uranium ourselves, and
yeah,
I
I
don't know
mean, if
how you would even go about that.
nuclear plants, you have nuclear fuel. That's just all there is to it.
Yep.
This is maybe a conversation for a different time, but I will say this briefly.
Go
People's
ahead.
understanding of what you need to build a nuclear bomb is based off TV and movies. You don't
Right.
need it's 1950s technology. The first bombs were plutonium bombs, and if you have a
Right.
nuclear reactor, you have plutonium. That's the result of the fuel being spent is plutonium. You may not have the yield that you want or the precision that you want, but this idea that you need to refine uranium to have a bomb, it's just not true. That's not true at all. And so people talk about, well, we're worried about, what if Russia uses a nuke in Ukraine? There's a non-zero chance that Ukraine already has a response. Let's just say a response. And there's a
Right.
non-zero chance it's sitting in a warehouse somewhere in Moscow right now.
If
So
there's anyone that knows Russia and how to fight back, it's the Ukrainians, and that's why
yeah,
I live here. It's why my faith is always in Ukrainians first. And I struggle, and I appreciate you said this in our chat the other day when we had with Sean and I, and you said don't be ashamed to be American. It's not that. It's that we don't look great right now. But I appreciate you that you spoke up very clearly because you're right.
yeah,
And actually, as a Texan, when certain people get very unpatriotic in my space, I get kind of pissy
yeah.
about a certain dignity and respect I want my country to project and most importantly live up to.
Mhm.
So
I agree 100%. It's you can be proud to be an American and complain
that's
about
why
America at
Williams
the
hat
same
instead of
time.
the other one. I put my Houston Astros World Champions hat back on tonight just for all of this. I want to remind our friends I have an article I put out over the weekend called Gods, Guns, and Armageddon, How the End Times Theology Captured the Pentagon. And I have a bigger one looking forward to give to you on informed napalm. It's a big one. It's actually distillation from my book that I've been working on for them for a while. It's a shorter version just to acknowledge that it is now 12 years this weekend since Inform Napalm are fined Ukrainian information supergiants in my book emerged to redefine how OSINT works. And Benjamin, let's plan to have another one of these as soon as possible. and we'll go
Sure.
into OSINT's side of discussions because I know we have a very interested crowd for that.
Yes. Sounds great.
All right. So
All
Luke,
right.
see you soon, and Benjamin, thank you for joining, and to everyone else, catch the recordings, and we will be back throughout the week. Now, I don't have my schedule for tomorrow and the next night. There will be something working on it. On Thursday, we have Chloe Craft will come back, and we're going to talk about journalism and a few updates about how to cover the war, about some tools that we use to do so, some positions we have about being journalists. And then, of course, Friday, we have Sean Penner doing our weekly Ukraine report. But I'm actually working on having Steve Hassan, our cult expert, joining us, just trying to pick out which days. And so between now, tomorrow, and Wednesday, we will definitely put some items in the slot. There will be articles coming out because it's my cathartic way of saying fuck off. That's to you guys. But to the people who piss me off on my timeline, I just get at the keyboard. I go, he said what? Yeah, well, fuck, we're going to have to write about that shit. So pay attention to the timeline. Make sure you're following Benjamin's account and Luke's account, and we'll see you soon. Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава.
И пиздец Російської Федерації.